In this story, I am going to tell you how I, Maya, 29, a quiet barista, built a paper trail, a secret recording, and a camera to take down a supplier who was ruining our shop. I documented everything. But HR ignored me and he kept getting away with it, so I invited him in for a fake thank you meeting, poured him a cup, and played the evidence for everyone to hear. What happened next, the lunge, the sudden silence, and the way our neighborhood turned on him, ended his power and changed my life. Stay with me and I'll show you exactly how I staged it, why it worked, and what revenge looked like when it actually mattered. My name is Maya Hart, I am 29, I live in Portland, Oregon, and for most of my life I have been the kind of person who tries to keep the peace. I have a small apartment with a plant I have somehow kept alive for 3 years, a bike that I am proud of, and a shift at a local coffee shop that gets me up before sunrise. People tell me I am patient and kind, and sometimes I believe them. I like to think I am steady, the kind of person who notices who is left out of conversations and saves the last piece of cake for someone who needs it. But steady does not mean weak. The trouble began the winter I started managing the roastery side of the shop when a man named Greg, a regular coffee supplier and a so-called friend of my boss, started treating me like I was invisible and then like I did not deserve to exist. At first it was a prickling of unfairness, snide comments about how my ordering numbers were off, the implication that I didn't understand margins, an eyebrow lift when I corrected an invoice. Then the barbs grew louder. He began to show up during my shifts and shout small humiliations at me while customers watched. A joke about my accent, a comment about my single status, a laugh when my hands trembled taking an order. Once, standing by the counter while the morning rush streamed past, he leaned into a customer's ear and called me ungrateful in a voice meant to humiliate. It felt like being watched through a glass I couldn't break. He escalated with a careful cruelty that read like strategy. Late deliveries he blamed on my incompetence. Orders would arrive missing pounds of our best beans because he'd siphoned them for other accounts. Once he deliberately sabotaged a batch of bags so we had to give customers free coffee and lost a weekend sales. Each incident was small enough on its own, an angry email, a misplaced pallet, but together they formed a pattern that tightened around my throat. I tried the reasonable routes. I complained to my manager. I made spreadsheets, saved messages, printed invoices. I logged every missing sack and mismatched delivery. Management smiled the ways people smile when they don't want to choose sides, soothing phrases, promises to look into it, then the schedule change that put me on double weekend shifts. I felt punished for asking for protection. It was like watching a slow drain of light from the room. At home, the words followed me. I would lay awake and hear his laughter again, the casual cruelty echoing in my ribs. The heat in my chest swelled into something colder than shame and anger that made me tidy my evidence with the same care I used to pull espresso shots. The man who had called me useless at the window now had the power to make my job a daily humiliation. I loved the shop and its early patrons who came for warmth and gossip. I loved that part of my life with a small fierceness. Letting him dismantle it for the sake of a supplier's favor felt unbearable. If no one would listen, I told myself, then I would make them see. My world narrowed to one clear need: to stop him from hurting anyone else and to reclaim my dignity. I began making plans to fix things the right way. I took my evidence and my spreadsheets to human resources and I laid out the pattern: missing stock, false invoices that redirected product to his other accounts, and the way he showed up drunk and loud on busy mornings. Human resources listened politely and promised to investigate, but weeks passed and nothing changed. Greg kept up the same pattern of petty cruelty. I started to dig deeper on my own. I cross-referenced delivery receipts against our bank statements. I called other shops quietly and asked about their supplier experiences, and I put together a timeline of every time a problem aligned with the mornings he happened to be in the area. I even purchased a cheap camera for the back alley deliveries and started logging his truck license plate number whenever he stopped by. For a while it felt like progress, like a slow, cold march toward justice. Then everything got worse. Greg found out I had been talking to others. He cut off orders to our shop, claiming we owed him money, and he started spreading stories about me, that I was disorganized, that I was stealing tips, that I had mismanaged the busiest weekend shifts. Customers I had known for years hesitated. A couple of coworkers stopped asking how my day was. The manager, who had once winked at me in meetings, suddenly told me my tone was unprofessional and asked me to take a leave day to calm down. I felt smaller than I had the week I moved into my first apartment. My head swam with the possibility of losing my job. The spreadsheets I had created felt like the only lifeline, but even those could be dismissed as obsessive. All of my evidence felt fragile. The more I pushed, the more Greg tightened his circle of influence. When he showed up at my door one evening demanding to speak, pushing the small of his hand against the frame like he owned the hall, I refused to open it. He left a note telling me I was burning bridges and would be sorry. I started to wonder if the only way anyone would pay attention was if I hit back in a way they could not ignore. I remembered the way my grandmother used to say, "Keep receipts, keep your hands steady." I went back through every printed invoice and call log, turning my tiny kitchen table into a war room. Post-it stuck to envelopes, dates circled in red, a map of delivery routes drawn in pencil across the back of an old takeout menu. I rehearsed what I would say if someone finally asked, concise, factual, no trembling voice. At night, I listened for the truck on our street and jotted down the time when headlights hummed past. Daylight felt both too bright and too exposing. I learned to move with a quieter purpose, answering questions with short sentences and practicing the calm I would need when confronting not just Greg but the complacency around him. Fear was there, but so was a steady, colder thing. The sense that doing nothing made me complicit in a pattern that would hurt others. If HR would not act quickly, I would have to make the pattern visible in a way that could not be waved off as paranoia. I started contacting other shops more boldly, trading the names of delivery managers and a few photographs from the alley camera. The responses were small at first, a sympathetic text, a scanned invoice with a mismatched signature, but they built into something larger. Piece by piece, the evidence stopped looking like the fidgeting of a hurt employee and started to look like a map of intentional theft. I knew the risk, I knew the cost, but the longer I waited, the louder Greg got and the smaller I allowed myself to become. The plan to hit back was not about vengeance for its own sake, it was about refusing to be erased. That night, when I slid another printed spreadsheet into a folder labeled for investigations, my hands did not shake. The night the shop closed for a private event, I knew my final move had to happen. I had prepared for weeks. I had copies of bank records, invoices, the delivery logs, and a voice recording I had made when Greg admitted to taking product for his side accounts. I had also reached out quietly to a barista from a different neighborhood shop who had told me he had been on the receiving end of the same tactics. We arranged to combine our accounts and to approach the Coffee Association and a municipal small business ombudsman at the same time. But I wanted more than papers. I wanted a moment that would make the truth visible to everyone who had seen me shrink under his words. I decided to stage a public reconciliation that would force him into the open. The plan was risky. I invited Greg to the shop for a supposed supplier meeting by telling him our manager wanted to thank him for his help. I cleared the back room, I set a pot of the shop's best small batch roast on the counter, and I made sure the doorbell camera faced the entrance. I asked 3 regulars I trusted to sit quietly and to be ready if things went sideways. My hands shook as his truck pulled up. He came in with his usual slow arrogance, expecting to be debited in praise. I greeted him warmly, offered him the pot of coffee, and told him our manager would be out in a minute to thank him. He puffed up and took a cup. I asked him casually about deliveries and then steered the conversation to invoices and client lists. He laughed, and for a second I felt the old panicked nausea. Then I pressed play on my phone and played the recording of him admitting he moved product. The room went quiet. He tried to wave it off, but I had printed out the bank statements next and laid them on the counter where everyone could see the numbers aligning. I watched his face go pale as the regulars realized the pattern, and the baristas who had worked the late shift nodded at details that finally clicked. He began to stutter. He tried to grab my phone, but one of the regulars, a big woman named Rosa who had once pushed through a crowd to save a child, stood up and said in a voice that did not forgive, "We have evidence and the authorities will have to do their part now." At that moment, Greg lunged as if he could take the story back by force. It was a small, ugly lunge, and it made him look ridiculous, but it also looked dangerous. Before he could reach me, one of my coworkers stepped between us and called the ombudsman. The siren of accountability started to sound. Greg left in a fury, but he did not leave unscathed. Someone had filmed his truck idling outside. Someone else had texted a local business owner who had also been duped by him. The social network of our neighborhood shifted in a few minutes as private complaints turned into a montage of corroborating voices. For a moment, I feared I had pushed too far, that his fury would lead to a lawsuit or worse. My hands trembled as I waited for consequences to crash down, but something else came instead. People came up to me and said, "You were brave. We saw what he did. We will stand with you." My manager finally said, "I am sorry we failed you." Later, as the shop emptied and the event staff packed away tablecloths, a tiny wave of relief passed through me. The regulars who'd stayed to watch helped me gather the papers and stack them into a folder that felt heavier and truer than any apology. Rosa clapped me on the shoulder and said quietly, "You kept a ledger of your own life, kiddo. That's how we win." The barista from the other neighborhood arrived on cue, his face a little stunned to see how many nods he received when he told the same small story. We compared notes under the harsh backroom light, dates, times, license plates, the exact language Greg used when he tried to gaslight us. It was strange to hear my own weeks of sleeplessness recited like evidence and not hysteria. I slept badly that night, the folder on my bedside table like a warm stone. In the morning, the ombudsman called and asked for everything. The city asked questions I could answer because I had been careful, every delivery logged, every invoice cross-checked. Standing at the counter with the shop's pot of now-cold coffee, I felt a small, stubborn pride. The moment I had staged to make the truth visible had done more than humiliate a bully. It had pulled a neighborhood into the light and showed that documentation and courage together could change things. It did not erase the months of small cruelties, but it made them stop. The resolution that followed was not instant revenge and not a fairy tale. The ombudsman opened a formal investigation and our manager placed Greg on probation while an outside mediation took place. For weeks, there were meetings in glass rooms and polite emails that felt like tiny victories and loud, bureaucratic delays. Greg lost a number of accounts once other shops realized the pattern. A few proprietors I had quietly called came forward with their ledgers. He had to face fines for misdirecting product and for falsifying invoices. Our shop recovered slowly. Balancing the books felt like mending a torn seam, tedious work but necessary. I took fewer shifts for a while because I needed space to breathe. I slept later and walked my bike down the hill instead of sprinting, and the plant on my windowsill got more sun. People brought me coffee and leftovers and told me stories about times they had almost acted but did not because they felt they were alone. One older barista, Ruth, who had been through a strike in another life, sat me down and told me how quick it was to mistake being quiet for being helpless. She taught me how to draw a simple timeline that made patterns obvious to anyone who saw it. In the quiet that followed, I found a new strength. I started a small community meeting at the shop once a month where independent owners could share experiences with suppliers and learn how to track invoices. The first meeting had 3 people and a stack of mismatched notebooks, and by the fourth it overflowed onto the sidewalk. I felt less alone when others came and told their stories about lost deliveries, shady credits, and men who smiled while they took what wasn't theirs. The vindication I had wanted the most was not seeing Greg humiliated, though he was. It was watching the pattern end and knowing I had done something to stop harm that could have gone on for others. There is an odd aftertaste to revenge when it works. It is satisfying, but it does not make you into someone else. I still save a piece of cake for someone who needs it. I still water my plant. I still smile at regular customers and memorize the exact way Ms. Perez orders her black coffee. I learned that the hardest part of being a quiet person is believing your voice matters when it really counts. If there is a twist, it is that the final cost was not to my conscience but to my assumptions. I thought I had to fight alone, and I discovered the power of asking for support and of showing others how to document small violences before they grow. I now run a small ledger that I share with other managers, and I coach new baristas on their rights. I show them how to photograph invoices, how to save emails, and how to describe behavior without shame. Greg still drives through the city sometimes, and I see him from my bike as I pedal past, and the sight is strange and ordinary at once. He looks like a man who has been hollowed out by the choices he made and the people he chose to hurt. When I bump into him, he does not try to hug me, and I do not want to be hugged by someone who used to belittle me. Instead, I offer the smallest kindness that feels like victory. I nod and keep going because the real triumph was keeping my job, helping my coworkers, and making the shop a place where people are safe to be themselves. On slow afternoons, I write notes to myself, reminders of how I documented dates and receipts, how I felt scared and kept going, and I tape them by the register so the next person who doubts themselves might read, "You are not invisible here."